Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening. So, I know this comes as a bit kind of at the end of things. Actually, it isn't at the end of things, I think it's just beginning. And so, this video, I know not many people probably have seen this article, or they might have heard of some of the things that relate to this article. So, this is out of the Washington Post. It says democracy dies in darkness. They always say that out of the Washington Post. So this family you see here is an Asian family, and and the reason I'm going to read this article, it has a lot to do with the the debate around reparations that they had been talking about more recently. Social media, YouTubers, and some groups that have gotten together have talked a lot about reparations and should they have reparations? Is it going to be worth anything? So this is a semi-lengthy article, but I'm willing to share it because the article I felt that it had a lot of meaning and it had a lot of purpose, and it actually showed a lot of reasons why reparations is more than what people know. And it also shows a family who actually received reparations. So Mitch and Jane Yamato, they met after being imprisoned in an internment camp during World War II. And so this happened a lot to Asian families from this time. So their daughter Ginny married Robert, what is known as Robert Sifax, whose ancestors were enslaved at Mount Vernon. Okay, so you're going to see the correlation here with this. So this is an interracial couple, Asian woman who her family were people that were in internment camps, and her husband she married, his family were his ancestors were enslaved at Mount Vernon, and they were black. So or are black. So now, as a momentum builds for reparations, this family grapples with the America, or with what America should atone for, the wrong of, and you can't really see it because the wording is the wrong for the past. Okay, because the wording is sort of bright right there, so I don't think they realize that. Now you see this family here, and so this article is by a Tracy Jan in Sacramento. And so Sacramento, her mother's parents were in prison during World War II for being Japanese American. The Yamatos lost everything: their home, their leased strawberry farm, their dignity, after the government labeled them the enemy. So her father's ancestors were enslaved at Mount Vernon. Unlike the vast majority of enslaved African Americans, the Sifaxes became landowners. Okay, though it took an act of Congress to gain full recognition of their property rights. The impacts of government-sanctioned racism course through both branches of Robin Sifax's family tree. So the uncommon lineage shows how even token compensation for historical wrongs can reverberate through generations, affording a chance to heal. Japanese Americans receive reparations, a presidential apology, and a $20,000 check, more than 4 decades after their captivity. African Americans have not received anything. For Robin, reparations are a meaningful way to acknowledge the loss that both sides of her family have experienced, the loss of being able to live a normal life. Whether they were families that were uprooted from Africa and brought here as slaves, or families that were put in internment camps, they did not have the same opportunities that everyone else had at the time, the 28-year-old said. So the government should say, "I'm sorry," just like they did for Japanese Americans. This is the only way to start the healing process. But her family's experiences defy simple conclusions about the role of reparations in making amends. For Robin's grandfather, reparations made it official. The internment of Japanese Americans was a historical injustice. For her mother, reparations helped crack open the door to her parents' painful past, though no amount of money could compensate for the losses. But for her father, slavery was too long ago to determine who should benefit from reparations, and he is skeptical of how cash payments would lift African Americans into prosperity. And for her uncle, the plot of land bequeathed to the family before the Civil War ceded their wealth after enslavement, effectively becoming a form of reparations he said other black families deserve today. So now, more than 150 years after slavery was abolished, congressional Democrats, most of the party's presidential candidates, as well, and Japanese American civil rights leaders are mobilizing around reparations for African Americans. So supporters anticipate a House vote on the issue this year, as well as its inclusion in the Democratic Party platform. So it's the biggest push for reparations since 1989, when the representative Congressman John Conyers Jr., Democrat of Michigan, inspired by law authorizing redress for Japanese Americans, began introducing what is known as H.R. 40, numbered to reflect the 40 acres and a mule. That is the U.S. government and what they had promised enslaved people after the Civil War. And then they later rescinded that. So this is, you see it's kind of blurry, but you can see the family here. So that's Robert Cefax discussing reparations with his daughter, Robin, and the brother, Scott, in the home, Elk Grove in California. So supporters anticipate a House vote, okay? And so this is something that right now they anticipate this happening. Okay, I'm trying to go up. Okay, so 17 acres. For Robin and her family, the attempts to reckon with history began in Arlington of 1825. Robin's great-great-great-great-grandparents were Maria Carter Curtis, or Custis, I say Curtis, excuse me for that, Custis Cefax, and Charles Cefax. Okay, so Maria was the daughter of Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, and one of the enslaved maids, Ariana Carter. According to the historical accounts, Martha and George Washington, her second husband, had adopted Custis after his father died. Custis freed Maria in 1825, 40 years before slavery had ended, and gave her a 17-acre triangular plot on the edge of the Custis family Arlington plantation after she married. Her husband Charles remained enslaved as the chief butler on the estate. So after the death of Maria Carter Custis Cefax, her 17 acres were divided and sold, allowing her descendants to begin building wealth, courtesy of the Library of Virginia. And so this is a paper that shows public sale of the vulnerable tract of land, and you can see it here in Alexandria County, Virginia. And so Maria's white half-sister, Maria's white half-sister, Mary Anna Randolph Custis, married Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general. So the federal government confiscated 1,100 acres in Arlington Estate from the Lees for non-payment of taxes after they fled during the Civil War. So the Sifax land was confiscated too, because Maria did not have a deed to her 17 acres. She couldn't prove that it was hers. So nevertheless, she and her family continued living on that property. Okay, and so in 1866, Maria's eldest son, William Sifax, who became chief manager or messenger of the Interior Department, petitioned Congress to pass a bill returning the 17-acre land to his family, and the Sifaxes reclaimed their plot. Okay, so somehow they were able to reclaim the plot of land, and so this is like a map showing the Sifax land, which was 17 acres, and you see that area of Arlington National Cemetery there, and outside of it there's that triangular land that's just outside of it. And so now right here, what you see, what looks like a parking lot and a wall, is a stone wall that separates the former Sifax land, now part of the Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall, from Arlington National Cemetery. Melina Mara, the Washington Post. So this was a photo that was taken of that area. Subsequent sales of the property gave Maria's descendants the means to pursue education in professions in law, government, medicine, and business, according to the Robbins' uncle Scott Sifax. So our family is actually a case study in what would have happened if people had gotten their 40 acres and a quote-unquote mule. So said Scott, whose brother Robert is Robin's father. So Scott and Robert's great-grandfather, Charles Sumner Sifax, became a Howard University dean and mathematician. So their grandfather, Charles Sumner Sifax II, became a doctor after graduating from the University of Michigan in 1924. So their father, Charles Sumner Sifax III, became one of the first African American developers in Detroit in the age of redlining. And so the Sifax land adjacent to the Arlington National Cemetery was acquired by the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II. And so here you see these people pictured here. And so left is Charles Sifax holding the grandson William T. Sifax. Right is Maria Carter Custis Sifax, the daughter of Martha Washington's grandson and one of his enslaved maids. Okay, so that is who is in these pictures here. And so individual #22034D. On the other side of the country, Robin's grandparents were being rounded up for internment. Her grandfather, Mitsu, which they call him Mitz Yamato, was 16 in 1942 when the notices began to appear in Sacramento ordering everyone of Japanese ancestry out of the West Coast. Her grandmother, Jane Yamato, was 10 years old at the time. So U.S.-born citizens like Mitz and Jane, as well as their immigrant parents, were given just days to report to an assembly center. Okay, so Mitz's parents left their belongings at their landlord's barn and a makeshift warehouse recommended by the War Relocation Authority. So his father sold his new pickup truck for next to nothing. And so as their landlord drove them to the train station, Mitz looked back at the farmland his parents had leased acres of ripe red strawberries that were ready to be picked. So I can't imagine what was on my folks' mind working all year for one crop and having to leave in the middle of it, said Mitz, now who is 93 years of age. Japanese Americans lost as much as $6 billion in property and income because of their forced removal and incarceration, according to the 1983 Federal Commission study that adjusted for inflation and interest. The government froze bank accounts, labeling them the enemy alien assets. Speculators took advantage of wartime prejudices to buy land for a fraction of its value. Other losses were less tangible, though still deeply felt. After boarding the train under armed guards, Mitz became individuals, hashtag 22034D, the letter D denoting that he was the fourth person in the family, after his parents and his older sister. So over the next 3 years, the Yamatos were held in 3 prison camps, spending the most of their time at the Jerome Relocation Center in Arkansas, which incarcerated more than 8,000 Japanese Americans at its peak. So Mitz's family was assigned to a barrack in Block 2, closest to the barbed wire perimeter, where military police were top sentry towers pointed their rifles inward at them. And so here's the pictures of this family, which is a part of this, they're all a part of the same family. And so left was Mitz, Yamato's parents, and Tansachi and Asako, and right, Mitz while in prison outside Jerome, Arkansas during World War II family photos. And so you can see it here. That's Block 2. And so because of the wartime labor shortage, Mitch was eventually granted permission to seek seasonal jobs in Chicago and Sarasota, Florida, after answering a loyalty questionnaire in which he swore unqualified allegiance to the U.S. and affirmed his willingness to serve in combat of the U.S. Armed Forces. And in those travels, he encountered raw discrimination plus less than white Americans. He was paid less or treated lesser than white Americans performing the same job duties, detained by police while shopping, and denied service at the roadside diners. So in California, although we were called quote unquote Japs, which is derogatory term to refer to Japanese, we were recognized at least, Mitz said. Then we became nobody, not black, not even white. And so Mitz was 19 at the time when his family was freed in 1945 and was given $25 each and one-way train fare. They returned to Sacramento to find their farm had been leased to someone else and their belongings were missing from the warehouse. I'm sorry, too bad, was the answer that they had received, Mitz said, and we never saw any of those items ever again. So his father, and then, now, who was 70 years old, was too frail to farm. Mitz, who had graduated from high school while in prison in Jerome, skipped college to help support his family, and we had to start from scratch, he said. Despite prejudice against Japanese Americans, Mitz found work in a hops field that was also pruned grapes. But like thousands of other Japanese American families who had dominated fruit and vegetable farming in California, Oregon, and Washington, the Yamatos never got back into farming business. So in 1949, the Mitz was hired at the Campbell Soup Company, packing cans for $1.20 an hour. And his mother picked strawberries on someone else's farm, and his father got a live-in job tending to the garden of a white family. And so this picture is Jane Yamato's fifth from the left in the back row with The Girls' Friendship Club is what it was called, while she was in prison at the Tule Lake in California during World War II. And that is a family of one of their family photos that they keep as a memoir of a not so happy thing that happened in the past. So they would never be fully compensated for the loss of their farming operation. Other Japanese American families received some restitution from the U.S. or the United States soon after the war, but the government paid out only a quarter of the claims for damaged or lost property filed under 1948 law, according to the federal report decades later. But life went on for Mitz and Jane, through his best friend, who happened to be Jane's brother. They married in 1952 and had 4 children, including Robin's mother, Jenny. And so for decades, the couple buried their experiences, rarely speaking of that internment camp. Government resettlements policy discouraged Japanese Americans from congregating in public, speaking Japanese, or living next door to one another or other Japanese American families. So the Yamatos urged their own children to assimilate. So they have a saying called Shikata Ganai, and you know it. Okay, so it cannot be helped is what the saying means, said Jane, now who is 87 years of age, who had been incarcerated at Tule Lake in California. So they said it was something that we had to endure, and we did, and we kept quiet. Our generation never said nothing about it. And so these are more pictures here, and these are not good pictures that you would think they were. They're actually internment camps. And so children leave the grade school at the Jerome internment camp, which imprisoned more than 8,000 people of Japanese ancestry at its peak. And so 2 young farmers imprisoned at the Jerome camp searched for signs of sprouts, and they wanted to see which of the California products they had successfully grown in Arkansas soil. That's to the right. And so at the bottom here, there's more pictures, and Japanese Americans are removing mattresses and cots at the store and storing them in a warehouse as the Jerome internment camp prepares closing. Okay, so that's to the left, and to the right, what looks like prisoners are preparing drainage ditches in front of the Block 7 mess hall at Jerome's internment camp. And so an apology, the public apology. Meanwhile, younger Japanese Americans, or third generation known as Sansei, began responding to their parents' silence about the wartime experiences with political activism. So the momentum for reparations gathered in 1980s. So the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment Camps of the Civilians held public hearings around the country, allowing the older Nisei generation to speak out about the mistreatment for the first time. So Mitz and Jane did not participate in that. They still could not bring themselves to share details of their imprisonment with their children, and let alone the world. So the commission determined that the President Franklin D. Roosevelt executive order to incarcerate Japanese Americans was spurred by racism and wartime hysteria, not military necessity, and recommended that reparations be paid to those survivors. So Congress passed a Civil Liberties Act in 1988 with black lawmakers backing the redress. But legal scholars said that the law was narrowly framed so as not to serve as a precedent for any kind of reparations claim. Only Japanese Americans who were sent to internment camps and still alive when the bill passed would be compensated. So not their children or their grandchildren. So you heard that. So some in the black press decried Japanese American redress. with the New Pittsburgh Courier declaring it the latest slap in our black faces by white America. Okay, so some 82,210 former prisoners out of 120,000 received reparation checks, an apology from President George H.W. Bush, and later President Bill Clinton. So the rest, including Mitz and Jane's parents, had already died. And at first, Mitz did not think that he deserved to be compensated. It was his parents, not him, who had suffered the most. He said they had something and they lost it. Mitz and Jane gave half of their combined $40,000 in reparations to their four adult children, so they could get a better head start in life, a symbolic transfer of wealth after everything that had been taken away. Okay, so here what you're seeing is internment camps. And so this is a section of the Jerome internment camp looking northwest. That's the picture of all the what look like their track buildings. They're internment camps. It's an internment camp. And so these are people who were being imprisoned. Jerome prisoners wait to be put in the train to transfer to the Gila River internment camp in Arizona. And so you see there were even children there. Their daughter Guinea Yamato Cefax, then 30 years old, married Robert Cefax, and raising Robin's older brother Ryan, put her share of her reparations, which was $5,000, into an investment account Mitz had opened for her as a child. So it would take another 30 years and a pilgrimage to the Jerome internment camp before the full weight of her parents' experiences would feel real to Jenny. So during the trip last April, her father pointed out the spots on the map where the barracks once stood and the barn where the fellow prisoners had hung himself in despair. So the floodgates hit me. Just pure sadness for my parents and grandparents, said Jenny, now who is 61 years of age. That was when I just totally realized the injustice, it says. So she does not think that the government payout is enough for what Japanese American families lost. So I don't think you can put a dollar amount on it, Jenny said. It's not just financial loss, it's emotional loss. You're being uprooted from a place that for my grandparents was the land of opportunity, and you come to work your tail off, and then you lose that sense of security of having a home. Suddenly it is all gone. At his kitchen table, Mitz fought back tears, grateful to the younger generation who had pushed for reparations. The young people, they made things happen, he said. Thanks to them, our history wasn't swept under the rug. So cash compensations made the government apology feel more sincere, Mitz said. And he considered his black in-laws, that's the black side of his family, the healing potential that redress for slavery could bring. So you should pay for your mistakes, he concluded. And so that's pretty much how Mitz feels about that situation in terms of black people getting reparations. He would know. And so that was his comment. After their Sacramento home, Mitz helps Jane up the stairs before lunchtime. So, still waiting, in 1989, the government poised to disburse $1.6 billion to Japanese American survivors of wartime incarceration. Conyers, the Michigan congressman, introduced his bill to create a commission to study reparation proposal for African Americans living with the legacy of more than 2 centuries of slavery and subsequent segregations. So it drew only 24 sponsors at the time. So Conyers reintroduced that bill every legislative session until he resigned from Congress in 2017. Each time the bill failed to move beyond the House Judiciary Committee. And while the House and Senate apologized for slavery in 2008 to 2009, the symbolic moves did not accompany action on reparations. Conyers died in October at the age of 90 years old, but the Scott Sifex, for him, Jimmy's brother-in-law, compensating African Americans for the stolen wealth of their enslaved ancestors generated, as well as the government-sanctioned discrimination in employment, housing, lending, education, and policing, just makes sense. Even the promise of the New Deal and the GI Bill, which helped lift white families or white Americans in the middle class, were never fully realized for black families and black Americans. So it's like an equivalent of the very layered cake of action and laws that have led to the economic disparity that we have today, said Scott, a retired chief executive of a real estate development firm who now runs a foundation to diversify corporate boards. Okay, so when we were freed, not only did black people not receive anything, he said, there were active pieces of discrimination, both cultural and statutory, that blocked us from being able to create enough in assets to transfer on to successive generations. So the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times that of the typical black family, according to the Federal Reserve data. So homeownership, one of the most important ways for families to build wealth, has remained virtually unchanged for African American families in 50 years since housing discrimination was outlawed. Over wine and cheese at his home last fall, Scott, who also hosts a political talk show on local television, and his brother Robert, a retired IT manager for the state of California, ran calculations of what cash reparations could mean for African Americans. In one scenario, they divided $500 billion, the amount proposed by former presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, by approximately $48 million black Americans, yielding roughly about $10,000 per person. So this picture you see here is a picture of the siblings Robert left, Veronetta and Scott Sifex, at the family real estate development on Sifex Drive in Washington, D.C. in 1970. And so going back to the article, you kind of look at the number and then say, oh, well, will $10,000 actually move someone into permanent prosperity, said Scott, 56 years of age. I don't see how you pay a segment of society that large and that kind of money and would require to improve anyone's position, said Robert, 61 years of age. But while he felt cash compensation was the best way to acknowledge how the government had wronged the Japanese American in-laws, Robert said reparations checks would do little for young African Americans segregated in neighborhoods devoid of jobs, education, basic infrastructure, and so on. And so the money, he said, should instead be invested in educational opportunities and community programs for systemic change. So then there are the questions that commonly come up when discussing reparations. How would it actually work, Scott asked. Should African Americans who came over, 40 years ago get paid or get a piece of this? Who gets this? Their mother's family had been sharecroppers on the Mississippi cotton plantation. Their grandfather migrated to Detroit and at 17 years old to work in an auto factory and never having the opportunity of pursuing an education. So who knows who he would have become had his family had access to the 40-acre and mule theory that were promised. Scott said, that side of my family deserves reparation. So right now, he said, there's a crack in the door in that there's at least a beginning of a discussion going on about reparations, of course, one that's happening in more areas than just black dining room tables. And so here you see pictured right here, this is Scott Sifex, who hosts an etiquette dinner for the executive development program he runs to boost the diversity of corporate boards. And so here he is pictured here. And so the new momentum, 30 years after Japanese Americans began receiving reparations checks, their descendants around the country are beginning to unite behind redress for slavery. So one of the things people say about African American reparations for slavery is the same thing people said to us when we were fighting for redress. You should just get over it, said Susan Hayase, 63 years of age, a third-generation Japanese American who fought for reparations in the 1980s. But petitioning the government for redress of grievances is the most American thing, a basic right guaranteed by the Constitution, she told civil rights activists gathered recently in San Jose, Japan's town. Okay. So public support for reparation has doubled since 2002, when just 14% of the Americans believe that government should make cash payments to Black descendants of slaves, according to the polling by Gallup. In 2019, 29% of Americans supported reparations, with Black Americans accounting for most of that increase. So Georgetown students voted last year to pay additional fees as reparations for the university's participation in the slave trade. And it goes on to say that cities are debating now their own version of reparations for redlining, predatory lending, and discriminatory practices and policies, with the Chicago suburbs of Evanston recently agreeing to create a reparation fund with a tax on recreational marijuana. And so the House reparations bill, now sponsored by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, Democrat in Texas, has drawn more than 120 co-sponsors, a record according to Keenan Keller, Conyers' longtime aide, and a Democratic counsel on the House Judiciary Committee. Sometimes facts take a long time to penetrate, and the issue of reparations took that very long journey, Jackson Lee said. People are recognizing that the healing that is necessary will not occur with just the passage of time. And so here's the family right here. And so you have Robin Sifex, who holds up the family photos of her maternal grandparents, Mitz and Jane Yamato, who speak their experience at the separate internment camps during World War II. And so at right is Robin's mother, Jenny. And so she, of all people, knows, coming from two backgrounds, having the Japanese culture in her family and the African American culture in her family, all too well she knows what reparations and the meaning behind it is. And so here's the family as well. Jenny walks her mother, Jane, to physical therapy, and on the right is Mitz, who carves a piece of wood at his workbench in the garage. So one afternoon, Mitz and Jane's ranch-style home, Robin unearthed a box of black and white family photos in the hallway closet. Tucked inside was a manila envelope containing official apology papers from President Bush, a 2-paragraph letter dated October 1990, 45 years after her grandparents' imprisonment. Robin examined the embossed presidential seal that read the blue type for the first time. A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. Neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold the rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. Robin contemplated the weight of those words, reflecting on both sides of her family, internments, like slavery, had been sanctioned by the government and accepted by most Americans as normal, she said, but the only side of the story has an ending. Only one side of the story has an ending. So this article was by Tracy Jan, who covers the intersection of race and the economy in the Washington Post, a beat she launched in December of 2016. So she previously was a national political reporter of the Boston Globe. So I thought this article really pinpointed in two worlds with an interracial family having had experiences in two different cultures of what it's like to have to go through internment camp or slavery, and one was compensated while the other hasn't been, and what it meant for that family that received reparations and what it meant for the family that hadn't received reparations yet, and they're just now mobilizing in political arenas over the issue in terms of conversation and dialogue over the issue of reparations. And so I thought these articles, or this article in particular out of the Washington Post, really put that in motion, that whole idea of why reparations is necessary. And it's not just only the dollar amount that counts, but the emotional acknowledgement that goes along with it, to know that people are suffering, generations are suffering, and still to this day have suffered. We have some articles that I've read recently this week where a man, he was not given an opportunity to cash checks. He got out of a settlement for discrimination. A bank refused to cash his checks and called law enforcement on him, and so he had to pull his money out of the bank, or he had to take whatever money he had because he was already a customer at the bank and had an account, but yet and still, because he had these big checks, they just didn't believe that it was his money and they called law enforcement on him. Had another article I read, which actually is more than one individual involved, where young students in Texas who have dreadlocks can't graduate and walk the stage simply because their hair and the length of their hair and their dreadlocks, which one of the boys, his family is from Trinidad. And that's a cultural hairstyle, and let alone some people have their hair in that way because of religious practices in some black cultures. And so they are being told to go to a barbershop, a local barbershop, and they feel that they have a right to make the kids cut their hair because it's not acceptable to even attend the classes at the high school. So he can't even go to school at the school. So his mother would pin up his hair and put a boy bun or a man bun, but that wasn't deemed as acceptable. It was unacceptable. So they're pretty much forcing the idea that they have the right to discriminate him based on his hair, that he can't attend classes and he can't go to school there and he can't graduate because of his hair. And so we still to this day, even though Governor Gavin Newsom in California has a law or a bill that was passed called the Crown Act, which I know Texas is outside of California, of course, another state. It took this long for this thing to pass and be recognized, and yet you still have other states that are discriminating African American or African peoples for their hair. And so we still go through a lot of injustices. There's been police shootings of black and female black women. There have been a lot of different things that have occurred, and if it is in the social media or publicized, it's there. A lot of those People get exonerated who have participated in the death of someone who they claim might have a weapon. It turns out they investigate the situation. They didn't have a weapon. They have a cell phone. So there's a lot behind that. And so it shows that we have yet to receive the compensation that is much due, long overdue. And this article, I thought, pointed out a lot of comparison as to why it's important that, you know, when these things, these wrongs happen, that you make these wrongs as right as possible. And in doing so, there's a healing process that occurs. And so, in order to heal, you not only apologize, but you also have to show that you mean that apology. And so, having said that, I'm going to let this article go. And I'm flipping through the pictures, and you can see this family here that come from two different worlds, but similar discriminations be based on race. And so how important that is to see how it affects people and how still people are affected by these issues even today. Having said that, I'm going to let this go. What are your thoughts on this? I don't know if we ever will come to a place, but it may just be as well, just like this family, where some of us might get to a point where we're in our senior years and we'll finally see some compensation, some form of reparations to African Americans. We should hope so. Having said that, thanks for listening.